A little over a year ago, I made a video talking about film and TV adaptations of video games. Within that video, I talked about how such adaptations have been mostly bad, mediocre, or decent at best. At that time, the only two instances that a major adaptation of video games had resulted in something truly great and that appealed to all kinds of people aside from gamers were the 4-season Netflix series Castlevania as well as Arcane, which hasn't seen further seasons yet, but more are planned. Well, in the time that has passed since then, Studio Trigger received a lot of praise for their series Cyberpunk Edgerunners that streamed on Netflix, and then we got another great piece of media based on a video game with HBO's TV adaptation of The Last of Us. With acclaimed Chernobyl showrunner Craig Mazin, as well as the game's original writer and creative director Neil Druckmann at the helm, this amazing story was given the time and energy to be molded into a massive W for everyone involved. And yes, as someone who does love the original game, it was awesome to see Naughty Dog's masterpiece adapted to the screen with the time, attention, and gravitas that it rightly deserved. The Last of Us is one of the best stories ever told in the video game medium, and it's clear that the showrunners knew that. Barring some changes here and there, this is still the same story with the essential plot beats intact. Now, before going any further with my review though, I'd like to set the expectation that I'm not going to include any clips from the show here, out of my worry that HBO is going to issue me a takedown notice. It'll be kind of like my video that I made about the Halo show last year. Even though it's well within the rights of someone like me to use footage from a copyrighted show on the grounds of fair use, after what happened to my Valentine's Day themed review of Whisper the Heart and my appeal being turned down by Studio Ghibli, I just don't really have the energy to contest copyright claims. Unlike many other big YouTubers, my channel isn't monetized, so everything you see on my channel is just me doing it for the sake of my own enjoyment. But if I spend days or even weeks on a video which I get no financial gain from, only for it to be struck down, that's rather demoralizing. So, with Warner Brothers being notorious for their copyright claims, I'm not going to risk having this whole video consist of clips from various episodes. Instead, you'll get footage of me playing The Last of Us Remastered with voiceover laid on top of it, while I will insert the occasional screenshot from the show here and there. Oh, and I will be touching on pretty major spoilers from both the original game and the show here, so if you haven't experienced either one, consider this your warning. Okay, so the big thing I want to address up front is this. Does the show offer a better alternative experience to the game? My short answer to that is no. People often lodge the typical PlayStation movie game with engaging cinematics but bad gameplay complaint against The Last of Us, and I frankly think that's a rather basic criticism. There are things you can legitimately criticize about that original game, but I don't think the core gameplay in contrast to the narrative is one of them. Even though you ultimately play The Last of Us to experience the story, there is plenty of fun to be had in soaking in the environments that still look great on the remastered version almost a decade later. The combat is dynamic and allows for some very engaging encounters, and yes, it's even fun to raid countless drawers for supplies. The Last of Us is a game that has value in the quiet moments of just exploring and absorbing the scenery with Ellie, as much as the set pieces and cutscenes keep you tightly gripped to your controller. In distinguishing a video game from a TV adaptation of one, though, there has to be some recognition of the basic elements that make those two mediums of art different. The biggest of these is interactivity, which is an integral part of making the person engaging with the art connect with what they're experiencing. Season 1 of The Last of Us depicts all of the important plot points of the game, sometimes even directly recreating the shot composition and line deliveries, but the game features significantly more combat than the show does. Not that the show necessarily needed a lot of action to keep its audience engaged, but as far as the game is concerned, it also uses the combat, as fun as it is, as a means of convincing the player of how depraved this post-apocalyptic America has become, in addition to how much of a brutal loose cannon that Joel can be. So, in contrast, the show has to work hard to keep its audience engaged without a controller being in their hand. One way in which Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann do this, and rightly so, is by inserting some original content wherever it makes sense. This was much more common in the first 5 episodes as opposed to the last 4, in which the major story points were still very accurately adapted from the game, but the changes they made were actually welcome additions to an already great story. In particular, each of the first few episodes did a good job at giving a soft open that provided chilling new looks into the game's world. Whereas the game itself funnels most of its lore dump into the credit scene immediately after Sarah's death, along with collectible artifacts you can find hidden in each level, these added scenes in the show established a palpable mood for the drama recreated from the game's many cutscenes. These scenes also allow the core relationships to shine, since the dialogue is just focused on building the characters and how they all play off each other. Similarly to Mazin's previous show Chernobyl, the dedication to building out the smaller ancillary details helps the bigger moments hit with greater force. Therefore, when the most memorable scenes from the game reappear in the show, they're effective regardless if you have the game in the back of your mind. This does present an ironic problem the show causes for itself, though. You see, as I touched on a little bit ago, for the moments that are lifted from the game, dialogue, shot composition, and even quirks from the original performances are recreated in pretty explicit detail at times. The later that the show goes on, the more that those moments are directly adapted from both script and visual standpoints. It's undeniably great to see just how well these actors and crew members are able to pay tribute to those scenes, but it's inherently less exciting to see a visual moment recreated in a different medium rather than a book being adapted to the screen. Because at least in that kind of scenario, the only other visual reference you would have had is what you imagined in your head. At least, this is the case for me with the game, being as memorable as it is, already being a frame of reference in my mind. It's a weird position to be in having played the game, because I wanted the story to remain intact so that people who don't play video games could still appreciate it in the same way. And that's pretty much what we got here, so I have no real reason to complain. And yet, when it comes to my own experience with the show, it doesn't supersede the game for me. Naughty Dog's masterpiece is still the definitive way to experience the story, given that its structure is an action game with combat, exploration, stealth, moments of levity, and light environmental puzzles works in its favor so perfectly. There's also something to be said, funny enough, about how much more focused and even subtle that original game is. People still debate over the moral quandaries of the game even to this very day because the story refused to pick a side. Even as you're making a westward trek across the post-apocalyptic United States, with the goal of delivering humanity's potential savior to the Fireflies, the game doesn't make your actions out to be the stuff of heroes. The journey that Joel and Ellie take is a horrific trail of blood, such as is the case for the game and the show. But the difference is that even when the game had these big moments of dramatic tension exploding between characters, the conversations never felt like they were forcing any themes or awkward dialogue onto the viewer. Experiencing the cutscenes with their very natural conversational flow, and then seeing the acting process unfold on the game's making of documentary Grounded, one would be able to pick apart the themes without relying on the characters to summarize everything. It also helps that actively living through these characters' trials and tribulations through gameplay puts the player into their mindsets. You can't say the same was always the case for the show, with some characters like Melanie Lynskey's original character Kathleen quite literally spelling out her whole character arc as though she were stuck in a rehearsal for a Greek play. There are quite a few moments like this where it seems as though Mazin and Druckmann lost faith that their audience could piece things together for themselves, due to some characters ultimately regurgitating major points of what Joel and Ellie learned on their journey. Not every single change made to the original story ends up being a net positive either, with an example being that David's facade as a Bible-thumping preacher plays up a tired cliche of a religious leader having evil ulterior motives. I also think that the episode that adapts the Left Behind DLC lost something by not contrasting scenes of Ellie scouring a Colorado shopping mall with flashbacks of her fateful evening with Riley. Whereas in the game it felt like a side story that also built up Ellie's character in meaningful ways, its adaptation in the show felt like a detour that derailed the pacing just as the momentum was ramping up to the finale, even though I still like how it turned out. But aside from those things, I really do need to give credit to this team for being able to pull off what is now widely considered to be the best video game adaptation out there. I don't know if I personally feel the same about that, but understand that's more so personal bias talking. Having played through The Last of Us 3 times at this point, there just wasn't much for me to be excited about after a while, especially since with each passing episode the show became increasingly reliant on exact lines of dialogue, performances, shot compositions, and story beats pulled directly from the video game. But that's also a thing that should be heavily praised, because this team was very faithful to source material, which was already magnificent in the first place. Since the show competently retells the game's narrative with much gravitas and emotional weight, the show does stand on its own 2 feet. I think the game still offers a richer experience overall if one was forced to pick between the show or the game, but given the reactions I've seen from people who only have the show as their frame of reference, one can still feel fulfilled from this take on Neil Druckmann's story. Changes made to the narrative to make it more suitable for television were also welcome. I already touched on how effective the use of unique cold opens was, but to touch on specific examples, the series premiere had a very chilling scene in which a scientist posited that humanity would, in his words, lose should a fungus like cordyceps ever mutate to the point where it affects humans. Other great examples include the scene of the Indonesian mycologist encouraging the military to nuke Jakarta after the fungus was discovered there, witnessing Bill's town in Massachusetts getting evacuated by Fedra, and then the finale where we witness the violently traumatic circumstances of Ellie's birth. Subtle changes make a difference here and there too, with them being just impactful enough for the watchful viewer to observe them and see how effective they are in comparison to how the game laid out its story. A lot of both good and bad discourse has surrounded the entirety of Episode 3 as well, given that it pivots away from Joel and Ellie to focus almost all of its time on the relationship between lovers Bill and Frank. I completely understand why some people have reacted the way they did to this episode in particular, but this was the kind of story that emphasized the show at its best. Craig Mazin really did understand the game's narrative and its world at the very core, since this completely original side story sees the beauty of human connection in spite of great tragedy. Plus, I think the way things worked out for Bill and Frank here, as opposed to the game, makes for a much more hopeful and satisfying story, as opposed to the ugly hand that these characters were originally dealt. Where the show does succeed the strongest in comparison to the game, is showing that even a world where zombified subhumans walk the earth, the greatest sources of hope and terror among mankind are just people themselves. Whereas you kill countless numbers of infected people in each chapter of the game, the infected play little to no roles in many of the episodes. In one sense, because of this restraint and showing the infected, that makes their few appearances in the show all the more impactful, such as the devastating horde of infected and the massive bloater which decimate the Kansas City survivors in episode 5. On the other hand, this allows the show to focus on the many different ways that the post-apocalyptic scenario affects humanity. Joel and Ellie themselves are great examples of this principle in action, since the show, just like the game, shows the stark contrast in how they behave in situations where their basic needs are met, and then how desperate and instinctively violent they become once their lives are in danger. It's just fascinating to see the many different choices these people make when they're either in survival mode or if they're hospitable. The show does very well to convey that with the world building, dialogue, and especially the performances. It goes without saying that Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey are phenomenal in the lead roles, although they certainly made the characters their own, despite how iconic Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson's performances were. Sure, they're delivering dialogue that is mostly similar or even directly lifted from the game, and since the showrunners are referencing material that was already visually cinematic to begin with, sometimes these actors were directed to imitate moments from the game, such as the very final scene between Joel and Ellie. Even so, I can appreciate that they both did well to make their characters work in a screen adaptation, where their arcs still feel fulfilling when control is taken away from the viewer. In particular, some people have said that the script and Pedro Pascal working together to make Joel a gentler, more reserved character than Troy Baker's Joel cheapens his personality, which is something I disagree with. Joel being gruffer, quicker to violence, and more stern in the game made sense for that version of the story, since the player needed to feel, I guess, comfortable killing a bunch of NPCs as Joel. Taking the interactivity away results in the writers needing to figure out new ways for Joel to be sympathetic for the audience, while not taking away the tragedy of his character as well as the more violent side of him. In fact, I think it just makes things hit with greater force when he does commit some horrible acts of violence, although the writers were careful to depict him being violent in very specific ways depending on the scenario. When he goes into complete protector mode in the finale, there's not a single moment where he is merciful to the Fireflies, even after one of them puts down their gun and surrenders to Joel. In this case, his vicious bouts of violence feel less like natural extensions of the Joel we came to know from the game, but rather how his circumstances forced him to act. Pedro Pascal is able to balance all of those darker aspects of Joel's character with the surprisingly tender weaknesses that the script explores, which was genuinely interesting to see. I have less to say about Bella Ramsey since she essentially just embodied Ellie. Nothing can ever top what Ashley Johnson achieved with her groundbreaking work in the games, but Bella Ramsey does an amazing job honoring her legacy. She brings the ferocity, vulnerability, humor, and other traits you come to expect, while relying greatly on her own physicality and emotional intensity to mark her stamp on the character. If they really do intend to adapt The Last of Us Part 2 for the next 2 seasons of the series, I'm confident that Bella Ramsey could carry the weight of the story on her shoulder. Season 1 did well to keep these balanced between Joel and Ellie, so she would be more than capable of keeping audience members engaged if, well, actually, I'm not gonna go there. In any case, I do think this is ultimately a very good show, although if one has played the game, then that may inherently keep someone from having a deeper experience with it. Even so, the story adapts the game in a very faithful and respectful manner, while also adding worthwhile material of its own, making for an adaptation that has an attitude of reverence and innovation towards its story. I already thought that the video game adaptation curse had been broken before the show premiered, but now, let's just hope that this show will help pave the way for people to realize that video games are art that deserve to be respected just as much as other mediums are. Only time will tell, but maybe if video game adaptations turn out as well as The Last of Us, perhaps change will come sooner than later. And that's it! Thank you for listening to what I had to say about this show, and I certainly hope you enjoyed The Last of Us on HBO as well. Of course, if you didn't, just let me know in the comments what you think. If you liked what you saw and would be eager to see more of what I have to offer, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you won't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great one.